Boldwood presents Just for the Summer, written by Fay Keenan and read by Harriet Hare. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Sold. The sight of the yellow and blue rectangular sign atop the post in the front garden of Kate Harris's home gave her a jolt. Though the sale had been confirmed some weeks ago, the estate agent had obviously amended the sign while she'd been dropping off her 3 sons at school. A neat but spacious detached property in the heart of one of Cambridgeshire's most attractive villages, it had been snapped up quickly a few weeks back by a young family desirous of more space. Kate had been prepping herself mentally, and in more practical terms, for the ordeal of uprooting her sons and herself since the start of the year. It was only logical, now that the divorce had gone through and her ex-husband, Phil, had set up home with his new partner, that the house would have to be sold to release the equity and allow them both to start afresh. When the house had finally gone on the market in February, it had only been on sale for 6 weeks before an offer had been made and accepted. So now, in late March, knowing all of this, why did Kate's stomach turn at the sight of the sign? Why did her hand clench convulsively around her car keys as she pressed the key fob to lock it where it stood in the driveway? Why did her face feel hot and her mind start to race? Before she could take more than a deep breath, the phone in her other hand pinged. It was a WhatsApp from her friend and next-door neighbour, Lorna. Saw the guy come to change the sign. Any news about when you have to get out? Kate grinned. Trust Lorna to take the direct approach. She wasn't exactly renowned for her subtlety. That was probably why they got on so well, though. Kate, with 3 sons in the house, had discovered that subtle got her absolutely nowhere, especially when it came to them completing their household chores. She valued directness in her friends too. Turning sideways, she was unsurprised to see Lorna putting her recycling bins out and obviously waiting to catch her for a chat and check in. "Fancy a coffee?" Kate called as Lorna set down the last of her green bins. "I can fill you in on all the gory specifics if you like." "Thought you'd never ask," Lorna replied, hurrying over to the low fence that separated the front gardens and hopping over it. "It's been a while since we had a proper catch-up." As Kate made 2 cups of coffee from the machine that would, most likely, end up in storage for the next few weeks, Lorna filled her in on the latest gossip from the Year 6 parents' WhatsApp group, to which Kate had resolutely refused to belong to after she'd been passive-aggressively reprimanded for dropping the F-bomb on the forum. As one member had primly named it, with the caveat that, "I'm sure I'm not the only one who checks her phone in sight of small eyes," Kate, who had boys of 13 and 16, as well as her 11-year-old, had merely rolled her eyes and refrained from pointing out that she was sure most modern parents had said a lot worse in front of their kids, and if they hadn't, then their siblings certainly had. She encouraged her sons not to swear in the house, but she was pretty sure that once the front door closed on them, all bets were off. Fortunately, Lorna, who had a higher tolerance for the playground pecking order, kept her up to date with anything of significance. "I cannot wait to delete that bloody group from my phone the second the gates close on the kids in the summer," Lorna said. "I mean, don't get me wrong. Most of them are great, but it's starting to feel more and more like some high school movie as the kids hit puberty, and it's only going to get worse." "You're a braver woman than I am for staying on there," Kate laughed. "And I'm grateful, so you can give me a heads up on anything I'm likely to have forgotten for school." "Happy to take one for the teammate," Lorna grinned. "Inside, I'm counting the days too, but enough of that crap. How's the packing coming?" Kate sighed, slowly. "Much as I hate to admit it, Phil was right when he said that most of the stuff in the house is mine. It wasn't just being noble. I mean, apart from the hideous sideboard that I insisted he took with him when he buggered off, a wardrobe full of clothes, and then the usual splitting of the CD and DVD collections, and the pots and pans, the rest of it really does belong to me and the boys." She shook her head. "I never realized I was such a hoarder." Well, you were married for 16 years, and 3 kids will fill your house faster than teenage girls to the O2 Arena to watch Harry Styles, so it's hardly surprising. Lorna took a sip of her coffee. So when's the completion date? The first Monday of May half-term, Kate replied. Jesus, that's about 10 weeks away. You better get your act together then. You're not kidding. Kate sat back on the padded bar seat that had been hers for the duration of her marriage. Phil had been a creature of habit and would never dream of sitting in it, far preferring the other side of the table. That rigid sense of routine was what had made his sudden declaration just over 2 years ago that he'd fallen in love with a fellow architect at his firm all the more shocking. Within 2 weeks of telling her, he'd moved out of the family home and into his new love nest 1 village over and set up home with alarming speed. While she couldn't complain about his financial support of her and the boys over the past 2 years, and he'd been more than helpful in terms of his access to the boys at weekends and in the school holidays, now that the time had come to actually move out of the family home, Kate's sadness and grief was creeping back up on her. It's all right to feel miserable, you know, Lorna said, obviously sensing that behind the jokes about WhatsApp, Kate was struggling. You've been through so much over the past couple of years. And I know you don't like it when I call Phil that shit of an ex-husband, but you didn't deserve any of it. I'm fine. Kate swallowed a mouthful of still scalding coffee to try to get rid of the lump in her throat. It's not like I didn't know this was coming. Still doesn't make it any easier, Lorna said stoutly. I know when Dan finally moved out, I kept finding his stuff for months afterwards. I couldn't look at the hook on the back of the bathroom door without imagining his dressing gown on it. It takes time. Well, I've got a couple of months to pack everything up, Kate said, and Mum's offered me the annex at the bottom of her garden for the time being, although God knows how all 4 of us are going to fit in there. It's only got 2 bedrooms and a sofa bed in the lounge. Guess where I'll be sleeping. Sounds like it'll be, cosy, Lorna said. I'd offer you my spare room, but something tells me that the last thing you need is to witness the new people setting up home in your old house. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Although, now you come to mention it. What? Kate looked at her friend, who smiled enigmatically. Is the annex your absolute last resort? Lorna said. As in, if something better, but with a teeny, tiny string attached came along, you'd snap it up? Yeah, I suppose, Kate said. What are you thinking? Leave it with me, Lorna said, finishing up her coffee. It might not be what you want, but I'm pretty sure I can find you something better than the bottom of your mum's garden, for a few months at least. She stood up. I'll text you later. Don't say yes to your mum just yet. Okay, Kate said dubiously, but you do know that I've got 3 sons, right? And they're often not the most careful of people. If what you've got in mind involves anywhere expensive with breakables, it's a non-starter. Oh, your lot aren't that bad, Lorna said. I'll be in touch. Now get on with that packing, or at least thinking about what to put in boxes first. Wondering, as she often had over the years she'd known Lorna, whether her proposed solution would actually lead to more complications, Kate still couldn't help feeling intrigued. Anything that meant she didn't have to squish into the annex with her mum's beady, disappointed eye on her from the other end of the garden had surely to be a good thing, didn't it? Chapter 2. 4 weeks on, and Kate felt as though she was going to go bald. She'd torn so much of her hair out trying to get her sons to pack their stuff up ready for the move. Surely it wasn't essential to take every PlayStation game with them into their temporary accommodation. As it had turned out, Lorna's idea for a place to stay had materialised. She'd sorted out a charming cottage in a nearby village. Thankfully, not the same one where Phil and his new partner, Jennifer, were living, which belonged to a friend of hers. A holiday let. The teeny, weeny string that came attached to the place was that the owner wanted it freshening up before offering it as an Airbnb for the summer season. Strapped for cash already, so needing the job done on the cheap, he'd offered it to Kate rent-free if she spent the next few weeks giving it a lick of paint. Because it was a holiday home, The redecoration needed to be neutral and hard-wearing. Kate, who'd spoken to Lorna some time ago about possibly starting her own business as a painter and decorator, was initially thrown into a tailspin, until Lorna had reassured her that the owner couldn't care less what you do with the place, so long as it looks good in the photos. Kate had agreed to let the cottage become her first blank canvas, and was already excited to pick out some colours from the Farrow and Ball and Craig and Rose colour charts. With the boys at school all day, she hoped she could tackle the living areas and the 3 small bedrooms with minimal disruption to them, and with, at least in theory, as few possessions as possible. This shouldn't involve too much packing and repacking. As it was, the boys had moved most of their stuff that they wanted immediate access to Phil's house so that they could at least have it at weekends. But there was still a mountain of other random stuff to sort out. She stared around the living room in exasperation. Initially, she'd been really good at packing things into boxes, marking them carefully with the contents and rooms they should go in, and stacking the boxes in the conservatory. But as time went on and her frustration rose, she found herself grabbing the Sharpie and writing "random crap, living room" and "rubbish old toys, Tom's room" in rising exasperation. And that was before she'd even tackled the loft. Logically, she knew she should have started there first, but she hated climbing about in the drafty, dark space at the best of times, and now without Phil there to hold the ladder, she was even more nervous about it. But since the boys were all at school, and she'd hit a bit of a dead end in terms of packing stuff the family still needed until they finally moved out, she supposed the time had come. Struggling up the old aluminium retractable ladder, a few minutes later, Kate looked around in rising despair. She'd never expected to move from this house, at least until all 3 of her sons were grown up and she and Phil no longer needed the space. After the initial shock of Phil's betrayal, she had gone into a kind of long-term crisis mode, shutting out her own grief and anger in an attempt to keep her sons on an even keel, and only breaking down in private in the middle of the night when they were sound asleep, or in the early days when she'd done the school runs and was safely behind the locked front door again. She'd got through it with the help of the friends who'd stuck by her, Lorna especially, those who'd felt too awkward about taking sides, the couple friends who couldn't quite come to terms with the new status quo had drifted away. But the hard core of mates, she called her own, had helped her through it. Nights spent drinking wine on the sofa and putting the world to rights, and later, when she'd been up to it, nights out doing the same thing had helped immensely. But the hard reality now was that she had to tackle this mountain of stuff in the attic, the stuff that had been put up here and out of mind, that neither of them really knew what to do with. Bracing herself, she climbed the ladder, rung by careful rung, and then reached for the pull cord, for the naked bulb hanging from the apex. Stepping up into the boarded space, she headed for the first in a series of plastic-lidded boxes that were stashed in the eaves. The cool, spring breeze coiled around her like a waking serpent, and she shrugged deeper into her thick grey cardigan. She didn't want to spend too long up here. Opening the first of many boxes, she sighed in new exasperation. She remembered now why they'd been put up here. When her father had died, her mother, Selina, had downsized from the spacious family home to a smaller bungalow on the outskirts of the village. About a mile from Kate's current house, even though her new property had an annex, that same annex that was waiting stoically for Kate and her sons should she need it in later months. Selina had refused to store the seemingly endless stream of toys, games, and books from both Kate's and her brothers, Aidan and Sam's childhood, in the annex, as at the time it had a serious damp problem. Kate also knew that her mother had recently become a disciple of the Marie Kondo method, and so had been adamant that the old clutter just had to go. As a result, Kate had agreed to stash these in her attic, and even though her brothers, who both lived in Somerset, had come to visit since their mothers moved to a smaller place, every time they'd left again, Kate had slapped her forehead and remembered she'd forgotten to give them their share of the stuff. Well, she thought as she surveyed the boxes, there's no way all of this is going to storage at my expense. There were about 10 plastic stackable boxes that contained toys, board games, old schoolwork, ancient audio cassettes, and each was packed to the brim. She wondered if Sam and Aidan would be able to pop across at some point before her house move and collect them, but then she had a better idea. The Easter holidays were coming up in a week's time, and she'd been itching to take the boys away for a change of scenery, just for a few days. She couldn't justify a full-on foreign holiday at this time of the year, with the move coming up so soon and her eldest son, Corey, about to take his GCSE exams, but perhaps a few days in Somerset might be a good halfway house. She could take her brother's share of the stuff down with her, get a bit of fresh country air and unwind for a bit. If one of her brothers couldn't put her and the boys up, then she could book something last minute on the internet, she was sure. They'd all spent a raucous family Christmas together, their mother included, last year, when Kate and her boys had squished themselves into Aidan's 2 spare rooms, and Selina had stayed with Sam and his wife, Florence. Family harmony had been helped by the fact that Sam and Aidan lived in 2 of the 3 terraced houses on Bay Tree Terrace in Willowbury, which meant that they could all hang out together over the festive period without worrying about how they were going to get home again, and their mother could head off to bed when she'd had enough. That Christmas had been, despite the cramped bedrooms, one of the best she'd had in ages, and the perfect tonic to a stressful period of her life. Even Selina had defrosted a little, once she had a few glasses of Somerset's finest mulled cider, and it had been a much better Christmas than the previous year when, still reeling from the separation, she'd spent Christmas Day alone, as the boys had gone to stay with Phil. That train of thought was just the distraction she needed to head back down the ladder for the moment. After all, she reasoned, dragging all of those heavy boxes down from the attic by herself was risky business. She'd wait until her sons got home from school, and then they could help her so she didn't break her neck going up and down from the loft. Grabbing her phone, she texted the family WhatsApp group and asked if either of her brothers would be able to offer a place to crash for a few days during the Easter holidays. Sam must have been off shift, as he responded straight away. And they swiftly arranged a date, breathing a sigh of relief that now at least there would be 10 fewer boxes to worry about when moving day eventually came. Kate looked once again around her living room and wondered where to start. Chapter 3. When the Easter holidays came, Kate was relieved that the house was already in a much better state than it had been. The attic had been sorted, and her sons had been surprisingly interested in all of the stuff that was soon going to be stored in Sam and Aidan's houses. They'd spent ages looking through the evidence of their uncles' childhoods, fascinated by the old school books and the mixtapes that, in 1 or 2 cases, appeared to have been gifted to Sam by girlfriends past. If the careful, rounded handwriting on the inserts and the choices of songs had been any indication. Kate wondered what Florence, Sam's wife, would think of those, and then smiled. Knowing Florence, she'd just laugh it off. Everyone had a past, after all, even Kate, who'd met Phil aged 18, had had a boyfriend or 2 before that. Tom, Kate's youngest son, had discovered Aidan's old board game Battleships and had set it up, and, to Kate's astonishment, night after night for a week, he'd challenged each of his brothers to a game. It had actually managed to displace the PS4 in their affections for a while. On a rather different note, Kate had discreetly removed a naked centerfold of 1990s model Claudia Schiffer from their curious eyes when she'd opened an old A4 exercise book of Sam's and found it. The three boys had been pleased about a change of scenery for a few days of the holiday. They liked seeing their uncles, and Kate thought that, actually, a bit of time away from the house that was feeling less and less like their home by the day would do them all good. As she settled them in for the long drive west, she felt herself finally starting to relax. "Are we nearly there yet, Mum?" Will, her middle son, joked as they pulled off the driveway. "Nearly," Kate grinned, although just getting away from the house was enough to make her feel lighter. Lorna waved from her kitchen window as they left the cul-de-sac. She, as ever, had promised to keep an eye on the place. Kate would miss having her next door when they moved into the Airbnb place during the next half-term holiday. 3 hours later, and after watching the landscape changing from the flats of Cambridgeshire to the commuter belt and then the chalky landscape of Dorset, Kate finally made it to the Somerset border. The boys were getting restless, having swapped the front passenger seat between themselves when they'd stopped a couple of times en route, and Kate herself was looking forward to a cup of tea and unwinding at Sam's place. As they headed over the Mendips and dropped down into the small town of Willowbury, Kate caught sight of Willowbury Hill, the ancient mound rising green and stately out of the surrounding hills, and marvelled at what a beautiful place her brothers had found to live. There was something quaintly charming, too, about the sloping high street that, even though she'd been on the road for over 3 hours now, she took a detour to drive down. The shops that lined either side of the road were a delightful mix of the quaint and quirky. A health and well-being shop called Common Sense, with pastured-coloured bunting strung up outside that matched the violas in the wooden tubs either side of the front door. The cosy coffee shop, and a small gift shop just before the Travellers' Rest pub that stood on the corner of the high street, sand-coloured stone, warm in the spring sunshine. As ever, the mix of walkers on the pavement either side was as eclectic as the shops. Some were obviously tourists down for the Easter break and wandering up and down the street with all the time in the world. Others looked more like locals, busily completing their shopping and meeting and greeting one another on the street. Willowbury was a draw all year round for those people who wanted to spend some time in a picturesque Somerset town that had a feel and spirit all of its own. Not for nothing was it known as the New Age capital of England. Kate smiled as she saw 2 little girls wearing lilac fairy wings skipping along the pavement. Her smile widened when she saw the man holding their hands was also wearing a pair in the same vibrant colour. That image is Willowbury to a T, she thought, although there were plenty of people out and about who were more conventionally dressed too. Her eye was caught as she drove by the bright, vibrant display of the local bookshop, Vale Volumes, which had been closed over the Christmas holiday when they'd last visited Tom and Aidan, but now appeared to be doing a brisk trade with tourists down for the Easter holidays. "This place is so weird," Tom said from the back seat, "but kind of cool too." "It's certainly never dull," Kate replied. She loved coming back to Willowbury, and at the moment, the place was just the tonic she needed to get away from the stresses of the house move. A few days in the Somerset countryside would hopefully recharge all of their batteries. In a few more minutes, they were pulling into the parking space to the side of the 3 houses on Bay Tree Terrace. Reassuringly conventional, they looked even more welcoming when Sam, Kate's brother, loped towards them from where he'd obviously been working in the garden at the back of the houses. "Hey," he said warmly, giving Kate a hug and a kiss on the cheek. "You made great time." "Traffic wasn't too bad," Kate replied, once Sam had released her. She looked him up and down. "You look well." Sam grinned. "Florence is taking eating for 2 to heart, so she's cooking massive portions of everything." "That's not what I meant," Kate laughed. "But now you come to mention it," she poked Sam's non-existent gut. "How's she feeling otherwise?" "Pretty good," Sam said, tired but loving being pregnant. "She's popped out to grab some bits and pieces for dinner tonight, but she'll be back soon." "I was going to suggest dinner at the pub," Kate said, "but maybe tomorrow night would be better." "Sounds good," Sam replied, Catching sight of the boxes that were stacked high in the boot of Kate's Volvo, his eyes widened. Geez, you weren't joking about the amount of crap from your loft, were you? Kate, who was making sure the boys had their overnight bags, kept smiling. Afraid not. You can see now why I wanted rid of it all. With a hint of mischief in her heart, she reached into her handbag and pulled out the centerfold she'd found in Sam's old-school exercise book, which she thought better of binning in the end, and passed it to him while the boys surged ahead towards the house. Thought this might bring back a few memories. Sam's jaw dropped, and then, as if he was the 14-year-old that Kate remembered having such a crush on Claudia Schiffer, he glanced around to make sure Florence, or worse, their brother, Aidan, wasn't about. You could have just chucked this out. It was worth keeping for the look on your face, Kate teased. You were so nuts about Claudia. It was no wonder you never had a girlfriend. That's what you think, Sam shot back, grinning. You didn't know everything, Katie. Sure, Kate replied, but perhaps it's worth chucking that out before your wife sees it. Even if she's cool with your teenage crushes, the pregnancy hormones can play havoc with your sense of proportion. Noted, Sam said, although it is a great picture. On your head be it, little brother, Kate smiled. Now, are you going to give me a hand with the rest of this stuff or not? Still grinning, Sam popped the boot of the car and grabbed the first couple of boxes, proving, perhaps, that Florence's home cooking hadn't done too much damage to his fitness after all. Chapter 4. That evening, once the boys had settled into Sam and Florence's house, they were joined by Kate and Sam's other brother, Aidan, and his husband, Tom, from next door. Florence, true to her Yorkshire roots and her pregnancy cravings, was cooking up a storm, and after a couple of glasses of wine, Kate was feeling thoroughly relaxed. There was something so easy these days about just hanging out with her sons and her siblings. In the past, when her boys had been younger, she'd always been worried about what they were getting up to, but now, as they played an impromptu game of football on Sam and Florence's long stretch of lawn, she felt she could just chill out and let the evening wash over her. It's so peaceful, Kate observed as she caught the sound of a nightingale carolling somewhere in the woods that backed onto the house. If I lived here, I think I'd just be in a permanent state of relaxation. Florence, who was off the booze, but nonetheless seemed as chilled out as the other adults, smiled. The pace of life is a little slower here, although it's not quite the backwoods rural idyll it used to be. Since the railway line got put back in, a lot of commuters have moved in. You can get to London in just over 2 hours these days. So it's not just incense readers and organic risotto rice knitters anymore then. Kate laughed. Shame. Oh, there's plenty of that still too, Aidan chipped in. And if you want a neo-pagan blessing for your newborn baby, or an aura reading before you agree to marry the love of your life, that's all still available too. Kate raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Is that what you two did then? She said, grinning at Aidan's husband, Tom, who'd just grabbed himself a beer and was returning to the garden table on the patio. Aidan laughed. Nah, I knew he was a keeper, without Marietta Flaherty telling me what colour his aura was. Kate laughed too, then glanced to make sure none of her sons were in earshot. Perhaps I should have dragged Phil here 16 years ago and consulted a fortune teller. Aidan gave her a quick look, and Kate knew he was checking that she wasn't hiding a deeper meaning in the remark. Reassuringly, all she felt was the humour this time. It hadn't always been that way in the aftermath of Phil's departure. If he comes anywhere near this place, I'll shove his aura where the sun don't shine, Aidan said. He might be the father of your kids, Kate, but he's still a lying twat. Oh, come on, Kate admonished her youngest brother gently. It's water under the bridge. Really? Really? She took a sip of her wine. It's all about the future now. I mean, the house has been sold, and I've had the best clear-out I've had in years. It's time to move on. Aidan shook his head. And moving on means redecorating this cottage you've been lent, does it? Kate grinned. Well, it's a start. I can't afford to buy a new house, anything like what I had when I was married to Phil, but I don't want to rush into something I might regret, so the cottage will be a chance to catch my breath, to think about what I really want to do now, and what's best for me and the boys. It's weird, after all these years, to be thinking like that, but I'm getting used to it. You always did have a good eye for design, Aidan said. I remember when we were teenagers, you spending the Easter holidays one year redecorating your bedroom. Mum nearly had a heart attack when you suggested it, but you got stuck in, and even she liked it by the end. Kate grimaced, although, to be fair, those light purple walls and lilac curtains were definitely of their time. Purple's out for the Airbnb job, then? Definitely. Aidan glanced at Tom, who Kate noticed gave a slight smile and a nod. What? She said, as two pairs of eyes swiveled in her direction. Well, Aidan said, we were wondering. About what? If you've got nothing better to do for the summer, how about moving into our place and slapping a bit of paint on the walls? Kate nearly spat out her drink. What? The place needs a bit of a facelift, and I figured if you weren't up to anything else, you might do it for us. We'll pay you, of course. Aidan grabbed a handful of crisps from the bowl on the garden table. Can't Sam help you with that? Kate asked. After all, it's not like he's got a long way to go. Well, yeah, but I wouldn't trust Sam to paint by numbers, let alone my living room walls, would you? Oi! Sam, who had hitherto been kicking the football around with his nephews, looked affronted. I'll have you know that I've got great taste. That's why Florence made you take back the diarrhea yellow you picked for the baby's nursery, is it? Aidan countered lightly as Sam sank into a garden chair, breathing a little more heavily than he should have been after a casual kickabout. I hate to point out the obvious flaw in your plan, Kate said, but the boys and I barely fit into the spare rooms at Sam's as it is, and your house is even smaller. How am I supposed to decorate around you? And them? Well, here's the thing, Aidan said. Tom and I have booked a little holiday. Kind of the honeymoon we couldn't have because Tom was in that thing at Bath Theatre Royal straight after the wedding. My biggest role to date, Tom interjected. I mean, I wasn't going to turn down a crack at Godot, was I? Of course not, Aidan soothed, obviously sensing ruffled feathers. But since Tom's got a bit of a break before rehearsals start for his next project, we thought we'd push off for a few weeks in the summer, see a bit of Europe, and take the honeymoon then, so you and the boys would have the house to yourselves if you fancy it. And while I'm here, I get to spend some time redecorating your gaff. Kate grinned. Well, yeah, unless you've got other plans. Aidan raised an eyebrow. Kate shook her head sardonically. Obviously not. Except, of course, finding a house I can call my own, but, I'll put that on hold for you, little bro. So you'll do it then? Aidan, seemingly unaware of the ironic tone in Kate's voice, asked. Glancing down the garden where the boys were still kicking the ball about, Kate thought how lovely it would be to move into this beautiful, calm terrace for the summer. It would certainly take the pressure off having to find somewhere else to live. For the moment, and meant another 6 weeks where she wouldn't have to consider her mother's garden annex as home. That was something she definitely didn't want to think too much about unless it became unavoidable. If the boys are okay with coming over for the summer, then I'll do it, she said, turning back to Aidan, but only if they're happy. Fair enough, Aidan said. And I'll even make sure there's a bottle or two of the local cider in the fridge for you, if you like. How kind. Kate grinned. As they argued idly over what the job was worth, Kate, feeling distinctly awkward about haggling over prices with her brother, she felt a sense of relief. Okay, so being itinerant for the next few months wasn't ideal, especially with 3 sons in tow, but she loved being in Willowbury, and since it was the summer holiday, the boys wouldn't be missing any school. With Phil sharing custody, she was sure they could arrange the time between them so the boys were happy. Sitting back in her garden chair, breathing the scent of freshly cut grass and feeling the warmth still in the air, she felt a real sense of belonging for the first time in a long time. It felt odd to be so far from home, but she supposed she was with her brothers, and, in reality, her house in Cambridge wouldn't be her home for much longer. Just as she was contemplating all this, her youngest son, Tom, came back up the garden and collapsed dramatically onto the wooden bench near the table. "I'm starving," he announced, wiping an exaggerated hand over his brow. "Can I have some crisps?" "You're just about to have your dinner," Kate admonished, sighing as he reached out a sweaty paw and grabbed a handful of the crisps on the garden table, stuffing them into his mouth. Well, she supposed, they were on holiday after all. Tom, stoical, stocky, and cheeky to the last, grinned at his mother and kept chewing. "You're an oik," Kate admonished, but she could hear the affection in her own voice. She slapped his hand playfully as he reached for more snacks. "Wait until your dinner!" Just at that moment, Florence called through from the kitchen diner and Sam sprang to his feet to help her. "Go and make yourself useful to Aunt Florence," Kate said to Tom. Tom rolled his eyes and shuffled off in Sam's wake. Shortly afterwards, having obviously caught sight of the chocolate cake Florence had made for pudding, Tom's exclamation of delight was audible from the patio. "I think at least one of them's not going to have a problem living here for the summer, if Florence can be persuaded to cook for them." The older Tom of the group said wryly. "You may be right there," Kate said. She called to her two other sons, who came jogging back up the garden, more than ready for their dinner. She discussed the potential project with them over the next couple of days. Hopefully, Phil would also be on board with the idea. Chapter 5. Fortunately, after a few days in Willowbury, which had included more of Florence's brilliant cooking, several walks up to Willowbury Hill to burn it all off, and many, many more games of football in the garden with their uncles, the boys seemed on board to spend at least some of their summer holiday in the town. The laid-back atmosphere of Willowbury was having an effect on them all, and after a particularly enjoyable afternoon spent drinking Pimm's in the courtyard garden of the Traveller's Rest, Kate was deciding that she would be more than happy to move into Aidan and Tom's place for the summer holidays. On her return to Cambridge, Kate then had to contend with the dual worries of actually moving out of the house, moving into their Airbnb cottage for a couple of months, and arranging what the heck was going to happen to the boys for the long summer vacation. At 11, 13, and 16, the boys were too old for her to simply make decisions above their heads. It was important to Kate, as it had been throughout the separation and divorce, that they had a say in their situation. She'd always prided herself on putting them first, and this situation was no different. Now that she had to make more and more decisions on her own, it was doubly important that she got these right. Phil tended to concur with her on most things, which, given the circumstances of their split, wasn't surprising. He seemed desperate not to rock the boat. Kate, moving into the Airbnb cottage during May half-term, was enthused to be using it as her first real blank canvas. Having the project also kept her thoughts away from the sadness of moving out of the house she'd shared with Phil, giving her a new focus and something she could really get her teeth into. She loved transforming the place into something that would make tourists sigh with pleasure, and the rent-free existence insulated her from the more pragmatic concerns about what was going to happen with her living arrangements when the autumn came. Her sons, happy to have the relative continuity of their dad's house, spent most weekends with him, giving Kate plenty of time to scour Pinterest for colour ideas for the bigger project of Tom and Aidan's house over the summer. It was a project she was beginning to feel really excited about. Aidan, true to form, had told her to just pick some colours and get it done before we get back. Tom, who was rather more attuned to all things design, had made some suggestions and sent Kate several pictures of the new sofa they'd bought and the flooring they were considering to help her to narrow things down a bit. Between the three of them, they had come up with a broad canvas, and Kate couldn't wait to get started. It would be tricky with three boys in tow, and Tom and Aidan's black cat, Lucifer, to keep away from the wet paint, but Kate was confident that she could manage it. After all, she'd masterminded clearing her own house, moving herself and the three boys out of it, and settling them into temporary accommodation without any major catastrophes, so painting a few walls in 6 weeks should be child's play in comparison. Of course, just as she was beginning to put the plans in place for the summer, Phil decided to drop in a complication. Kate, who'd gone to Cambridge city centre for a trawl around the shops on Saturday afternoon with Lorna, was miffed to receive a text from him asking for the boys' passport details. She frowned. Phil hadn't mentioned anything about taking the boys abroad, and it was really something he should have raised with her earlier than a few weeks before the summer holidays began. Texting a swift reply, she waited, sipping her latte for a response. "What's he up to this time?" Lorna asked, obviously clocking the familiar frown on Kate's face. "I'm not sure yet." Kate replied, "I thought he was staying put for the summer, but he's just asked me for the boys' passport numbers." "Last minute deal?" Lorna said, "Maybe." Kate said, "He never bothered taking the initiative and booking anything for us when I was still married to him, though." She knew she sounded a little bitter, but she couldn't help it. Phil had always left big-ticket things like holidays to her to sort out. All the time they were together. And while they'd had some lovely trips to France and Germany, it had been her who'd had to do the logistics for them. Swiftly, the response from Phil came back. Kate felt a lurch of annoyance and something like jealousy, as it did Florida, she said softly, as Lorna raised a questioning eyebrow. 3 weeks? Leaving 2 days after school breaks up, if it's okay with me, of course. "Well," Lorna said, giving her an encouraging smile, "at least you won't have to worry about the boys for the first 3 weeks of the summer holes, and you can get stuck into the decorating without their huge feet treading emulsion everywhere." "Yeah, true, but it still stings, you know. We'd talked about taking the kids to Disney World when they were younger, and always said it would be better to do it when they were old enough to really appreciate it. Now he's doing it, but instead of me, he's taking Jennifer." She shook her head. "I know it shouldn't hurt, but it does. I mean, why wasn't I worth the trip? And she is." Lorna reached out and gave Kate's hand a squeeze. "Would you still want to be married to him? Just for the sake of a trip to see that ridiculous mouse and his gurning, 'Have a nice day' entourage?" Kate smiled slightly at Lorna's turn of phrase. "No, of course not, but it still makes me a bit sick." "Look at it this way," Lorna said stoically. "You don't need to worry about the kids for half of the summer holiday, and you get to spend the summer hanging out rent-free in your brother's house. From what you've told me about Willowbury too, it's not like you're stuck in the arse end beyond. Willowbury has more than enough to keep you entertained, and unlike Disney World, it's authentic. Go and enjoy it, and bugger the mouse, so to speak." Kate laughed, despite herself. Nicely put, as ever. They finished their coffee and headed back out onto the high street, determined not to show Phil that any of this holiday business bothered her. Kate sent a neutral text back to him, saying that she'd send him the boys' passport details when she got home. Then, putting it out of her mind as best she could, she focused on enjoying the luxury of a child-free afternoon's shopping. Chapter 6. Some weeks later, with the Airbnb cottage nearing completion and still not having found anything on the market nearby that she really felt she could buy, Kate broke the habit of a lifetime and decided to focus only on the short term. Always a planner, never a see where life takes you kind of person, she'd spent most of her life before and during her marriage making sure everything and everyone had been where they needed to be, had what they needed to have, and knew what they needed to know almost to a fault. Now that the boys were sorted out for the first 3 weeks of the summer holiday, she was at liberty to focus on what she was going to do with her time in Willowbury. When she got there, it was an odd feeling, and the thought of returning to her mother's annex in September still filled her with dread, but she was determined not to rush into anything. After all, co-parenting with Phil did give her a certain amount of leeway, and even if she did end up in the annex, at least the boys would have their rooms in Phil's spacious new house to escape to if it all became too much. Of course, she dearly hoped it wouldn't come to that. so she was keeping half an eye on Rightmove in case that elusive, perfect house within her budget suddenly appeared. Having the annex as a fallback was a useful option, though, and meant that the pressure was off to a certain extent. She knew that she and the boys couldn't live there forever, but at least they would have a roof over their heads, however small that roof was. On the day before the boys left for Florida, having mediated between the three of them over which socks, pants, and jeans really belonged to which child, Kate eventually managed to get all of their stuff into the car and get them over to Phil's place, an elegant, 5-bedroomed house in a village on the outskirts of Cambridge. It was a markedly different proposition to the place he'd shared with her. But then, Kate thought, Jennifer's salary as a full-time architect must have certainly helped out to buy it. As she parked the car, Corey, her eldest son, turned to her from the passenger seat. His two brothers had already flung open the rear doors of the Volvo and were impatiently waiting for her to pop the boot so they could grab their stuff. "Are you going to be all right, Mum?" Corey said, his face a picture of concern. Kate, quailing a bit inwardly but determined to put on a brave face, painted on her brightest smile and nodded. "I'll be fine," she said. "You just focus on having a brilliant time in Florida." "I'm looking forward to seeing Epcot and Universal Studios," Corey said, and Kate smiled back. "Just remember to text me occasionally and let me know how you're getting on." "I will." As they got out of the car and sorted out the luggage, the three boys strode ahead of her up the generous pathway to the front door of the house. They'd rung the doorbell before she'd even made it halfway up. The door opened, and Phil beamed brightly at his three sons, clapping Corey on the back heartily, reaching out and squeezing Will's shoulder, and then ruffling Tom's already unruly hair. "All right, lads, dump your stuff in the dining room, except what you need for tonight. We've got an early getaway tomorrow morning." They moved past him into the house, and for a moment, Kate and Phil were alone on the doorstep. Kate noticed that Phil's hair was thinning on top, and that the bags under his eyes were more pronounced than they had been. New jeans, in a more form-fitting cut than he usually wore, looked good though, as did the salmon-coloured polo shirt, which she also didn't recognise. Jennifer's influence, presumably. "What time's the flight?" Kate asked. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning," Phil replied. "Taxi's coming early." "Well, here's all of their documentation," she said, handing over the passports. "Corey wanted to keep them, but I thought it would be safer to give them straight to you." "Thanks," Phil said. He paused before adding, "You're looking well. Will told me that the house you've been redecorating looks great." "It was a good project," Kate said. "I needed something to keep me busy." "And Aidan's got you doing his house now, hasn't he?" Kate smiled, knowing that they'd already discussed all this on the phone, but realizing that Phil was trying to keep the conversation flowing. It felt so strange to be making small talk with the man she'd shared so much of her life with, but for the sake of family harmony, she went with it. She was about to open her mouth to ask a little more about the itinerary of the holiday when Jennifer appeared from a room off the generous hallway. To Kate's eyes, she looked a little peaky, perfectly well-groomed as ever, but certainly a bit pale. She wondered if they'd both had a bug or something. The boys often brought things home from school, and summer flu season was approaching. "Hi, Kate," Jennifer said brightly. "How are you?" "Fine, thanks," Kate replied. After 2 years, the three of them had reached a kind of amicable existence, but they'd never be down the pub drinking together. It was enough. "I think the boys have everything they need. They're all pretty excited." "So am I," Phil said. "It'll be great to get away before—" He trailed off, glancing at Jennifer, who cut in a little too quickly. "Before work kicks off again in September," Jennifer said. "We've both got a lot on at the moment, with that new development, getting the go-ahead over at Strensham Mead." "Well, have a lovely time," Kate said, "and keep in touch." She looked past Phil to where the boys were coming back out of the dining room, having dumped their bags as instructed. "Be good boys." she said as they came back to her briefly to say goodbye, and text me lots of pictures. Suddenly, the reality of her 3 sons flying 4,000-odd miles away for 3 weeks hit her, and she swallowed back a lump in her throat. She pulled her middle son, Will, close to her in a fierce bear hug, and before he could wriggle away, she planted a huge kiss on his forehead. Text me lots. Will wriggled away and exaggeratedly wiped a hand across his forehead. Okay, bye, Mum. As she bid her goodbyes to them all and made her escape, Kate couldn't help another pang of something that felt like jealousy, mixed with a rather dangerous nostalgia. No, she thought quickly, there's no going back, and I wouldn't want to anyway. Driving back to the cottage, where she still had a few things to pack away before her own trip to Willowbury, she tried to focus on the future. Chapter 7. 72 hours after saying goodbye to her sons, and safe in the knowledge that they'd landed safely in Florida, Kate looked despairingly at the peeling wallpaper of Aidan and Tom's living room and sighed. From the corner, Lucifer, the black-haired, green-eyed cat who inhabited the house, looked at her with an equivalent level of disdain. Why the hell did I agree to this? Kate said to the walls and the cat. Unsurprisingly, there was no answer from either of them. I must have been having a perimenopausal moment when I let them talk me into it. Glancing at the screen of her mobile phone, which had lit up briefly with yet another message detailing just what a wonderful time the homeowners were having on their 6-week tour of southern Europe, Kate had a good mind to text them back and tell them the bloody deal was off. She didn't need a place to live. She hadn't just accepted the job because she was strapped for ready cash, and in no way had she taken it on because she knew they felt sorry for her. No way any of that was true, honestly. I know they're paying me for this, but I should have quoted to include danger money. Kate addressed the cat as, having put out a hand to stroke him, he lashed out at her with his left front paw. Putting aside any thought of an amicable relationship with her reluctant housemate, she turned back to the peeling wallpaper, which dispiritingly revealed itself to be just another layer underneath which at least 2 more layers had been put over the years. The previous owners had slapped a bit of gloss paint over the top, a textured example of particularly hideous 70s decor, in the hope that it would spruce up the living room a bit, and as a result, removing the stuff had been hellish. That had taken the best part of a day, and now she was grimly steaming the last of the backing paper, trying to see if the walls were actually any good underneath. Yet again, Kate wondered at the wisdom of taking this job. Really? She addressed her remark to Lucifer, who looked unapologetically from the back of the dust sheet-covered settee. It wasn't as if I had a great deal of choice in the matter. The cat stared at her blankly, nonplussed that he had, to all intents and purposes, become Kate's confidant over the past few days since she'd moved in. Kate had a yen for dark, mysterious, and brooding males, but having been married to a man who successfully managed to keep his other woman a mystery for the past 2 years, she now appreciated a bit of honesty. At least Lucifer makes no secret of his disdain, she thought. That was progress. Grabbing her wallpaper scraper, she attacked the remnants of the backing paper with a little more gusto. 6 weeks had seemed ample time when she'd quoted for the job, but now she wasn't so sure. She'd need to patch plaster any spots and cracks in the walls before she got a watered-down undercoat onto them. Then there were the numerous other jobs, repainting the skirting boards, a coat on the living room door, waiting for the professional plasterer to skim the hall ceiling so that she could then paint it. The list went on. But this was what she'd chosen to do, she reminded herself, and it wasn't as if the owners of the house could nitpick too much. She was related to one of them, after all. As if on cue, yet another message came through on the Grand Tour Life Goals WhatsApp group of a lake in Tuscany, obscured slightly by the duo in question gurning a selfie in front of it. Between that and the messages from her sons, who were having a whale of a time in Florida, she was starting to feel like Cinderella. Kate tried to extinguish the flicker of irritation that flared within her at the picture. She should be happy for them all, and she was. Really, she was. But it was difficult to feel anything other than sorry for herself when she was the one, at age 39, without a permanent home, without a life partner, and without, at the moment, any form of steady income. Although the terms of the divorce and the house sale had left her reasonably comfortably off, there was still the future to consider. As the third photo came through on WhatsApp, she debated sending something rude, back by way of response, but then decided that a coffee from the high street might be a better option for her sanity. Ensuring the steamer was turned off at the wall, she cleared away her wallpaper tools and wriggled out of her white painter's overalls. Willowbury was what you might charitably call a laid-back place to live, but even she drew the line at striding out covered in paint. Her confidence might have taken a knock in the process of her divorce, but she wasn't going to let it derail her pride in her own appearance. Despite the fact that, even in her overalls, she was still likely to look less odd than some of Willowbury's more eccentric residents, she couldn't quite bring herself to let it all hang out just yet. With another 5.5 weeks left living in town, though, who knew how she might feel at the end of her stay? She closed the front door to the terrace house behind her, booting the recalcitrant Lucifer out before she did, and felt a bit lighter. She never thought she'd be the live-in painter and decorator for her little brother Aidan and his new husband, Tom, but then life had a habit of throwing her curveballs when she least expected it. Perhaps a summer in Willowbury was just what the doctor ordered. Chapter 8. If he looked back over his